Hi, I'm meteorologist Jennifer Collins. Now, as we know, hurricanes are large and intense storms that can cause lots of damage, especially to communities along the coast. Let's talk more about the impacts you might experience with one of these storms. The first one we want to talk about is that wind threat. Now, winds are how we gauge the intensity of a storm. The stronger the winds, the stronger the storm is. That wind threat can damage buildings, bring down trees, or even topper power lines, which could lead to extended power outages long after a storm has left town. The next one I want to talk about is that tornado threat. Now, tornadoes are found in hurricanes, but they're typically found in the outer bands of a storm itself. Now, the tornado threat tends to be greatest once a storm makes landfall because the winds begin to see friction from the land itself, and that's how you get spin to occur and a tornado to form. Now, these tornadoes tend to be weaker and shorter in lifespan than the tornadoes you typically see in the Central Plains or Tornado Alley. The next one I want to talk about is that storm surge threat. That's the greatest threat to life and property in a hurricane itself. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but storm surge is essentially the push by wind of that water onto land above normal sea level. Flooding can occur from the storm surge, but also from heavy rainfall or torrential downpours in the storm itself that could lead to flooding of lakes, streams, and rivers well inland of coastal communities. Now, the flooding threat tends to be greatest with a slower moving storm as you get more rainfall over a shorter amount of time. So let's talk more about that storm surge threat. Like I said, it's not just the winds, not just the waves associated with the push of the winds, but it's that push of water above normal sea level, and that's where you'll start to see water moving onto land. By 3 feet, it's above normally dry ground. Once we get up towards 6 feet, depending on the way of the land, that's where you'll actually see the water pushing inland at this point towards structures and buildings. Now, once we get up towards 12 feet, this is where you get the strongest storms, the Category 4, the Category 5. That's where we see water levels up to over 12 feet, and this is where low-lying structures tend to see water surrounding these structures, and if it's not properly built or built to withstand these forces, these structures can be lifted off their foundations, and that's where you get the greatest damage associated with hurricanes. So now that we know the kind of impacts you might experience, let's talk about where you might see them. Let's talk about the structure of the storm itself. The center of the storm, or the eye of the storm, is where you'll find the lowest pressure. The lower the pressure, the stronger the winds are in a hurricane itself. Now let's talk about the eye wall. That's outside of that eye of the storm. The eye wall is where you'll find the maximum winds of a storm. Let's split it up into 4 sections, or what we call 4 quadrants of a storm. Say it's moving to the north. That front right quadrant is where you'll find the maximum impacts of a storm. The greatest winds, the strongest winds in the eye wall, but also the greatest storm surge and the greatest threat for tornadoes in the outer bands. The front left quadrant, you'll still see a significant threats when it comes to the impacts of the storm, the storm surge, winds, and that threat for tornadoes, but tends to be the greatest in the way of storm surge, as you'll see the maximum winds pushing that water towards the left quadrant. Let's talk about the back right quadrant. This is where the winds begin to ramp up into that front right quadrant. That's where you'll see the most significant wind threat associated with the system, but you'll also see impacts, like I said earlier, of that storm surge and the threat for tornadoes. The back left quadrant tends to be the weakest side of a system, but like every part of this storm, it's still dangerous, so you still remain alert wherever you are in a hurricane itself. So now that we know the structure of the storm and what you might experience in way of impacts, you can better prepare ahead of the season to keep you and your family safe.